Something fundamental just shifted in California's economy, and most people haven't connected the dots yet. Starbucks, a company that helped define American consumer culture for the past 3 decades, is closing more than 300 locations across the state. Not gradually, not over several years. This is happening now, and the scale is staggering. We're talking about thousands of jobs disappearing, storefronts going dark in communities from San Diego to Sacramento, and a corporate giant that's choosing to pull back from the nation's largest economy. This isn't just about coffee. When a company this embedded in daily American life makes a move this drastic in a single state, it signals something deeper about operating costs, regulatory pressures, and the basic math of doing business. California's governor is facing questions he can't easily answer because this wave of closures touches on minimum wage policies, commercial real estate stability, and whether the state's economic model is sustainable. The real question isn't why Starbucks is leaving, it's who's next, and what this means for the millions of Californians watching their neighborhoods change overnight. Let's start with what we know for certain. Starbucks has announced it will close over 300 locations throughout California over the coming months. The company framed this as part of a broader restructuring strategy, citing changing consumer behavior and what they called challenging operating conditions in certain markets. That phrase, challenging operating conditions, is doing a lot of work here, and it's worth unpacking what that actually means when a multinational corporation uses language that vague. For years, California has been Starbucks' second largest market by store count, trailing only Texas. The state represented not just revenue, but cultural capital. Starbucks wasn't just selling lattes in California, it was part of the identity of neighborhoods, the backdrop of business meetings, the third place between home and work that the company always talked about in its branding. So when a company decides that hundreds of those third places are no longer viable, we need to ask what changed so dramatically that the math stopped working. The timing here matters. These closures are happening in the wake of California's latest minimum wage increase, which brought the floor for fast food workers to $22 an hour as of last year, with additional scheduled increases tied to inflation. Starbucks, while not technically classified as fast food, operates in a similar labor market and has faced pressure to match those wage standards to remain competitive for workers. That's a significant cost increase in a business model where labor already represents one of the largest expense categories. But it's not just wages. Commercial rent in California's major metro areas has remained elevated even as some other costs have stabilized nationally. Energy costs in the state are among the highest in the country. Regulatory compliance, from health codes to environmental standards to local permitting, adds layers of expense that simply don't exist at the same scale in other states. Now, before anyone accuses this analysis of being politically motivated, let's be clear about something. California's regulations didn't appear out of nowhere. Many of them were responses to real problems: environmental degradation, worker exploitation, public health concerns. The question isn't whether those problems were real. The question is whether the solutions have created a business environment that's sustainable and whether the costs are being distributed in a way that actually helps the people the policies were designed to protect. When a major employer leaves, the workers those wage laws were meant to help are the ones who lose their jobs first. Governor Gavin Newsom's administration has been largely silent on the Starbucks closures, beyond a brief statement acknowledging the company's decision and expressing hope that impacted workers would find new opportunities. That response feels inadequate, given the scale of what's happening. 300 stores don't close because of a few operational inefficiencies. This represents a fundamental reassessment by a major corporation about whether California is a place where their business model can work. And if Starbucks is making that calculation, you can bet other companies are watching closely and running their own numbers. What makes this particularly concerning is the multiplier effect. When a Starbucks closes, it's not just the 15 or 20 people who worked there who are affected. It's the foot traffic that disappears from that block. It's the suppliers who lose a customer. It's the landlord who now has a vacant commercial space in a market where retail vacancy rates are already climbing. It's the city or county that loses sales tax revenue, business license fees, and the general economic activity that radiates from a busy retail location. Multiply that by 300 locations spread across the state, and you're looking at a meaningful contraction in California's service economy. The service sector has been the engine of job growth in California for decades. Manufacturing left for cheaper states and countries long ago. Agriculture, while still significant, is highly mechanized and employs far fewer people than it once did. Technology, despite all the attention it gets, employs a relatively small percentage of California's workforce and is concentrated in specific geographic areas. For the majority of working Californians, the economy means service jobs, retail, hospitality, food service, healthcare support. When major players in that sector start pulling back, it creates a ripple that touches millions of lives. Let's talk about what this looks like on the ground. Imagine you're a 28-year-old shift supervisor at a Starbucks in Fresno that's scheduled for closure. You've worked there for 6 years, worked your way up from barista, you make around $24 an hour with benefits. The store closes, and now you're looking for comparable work in a market where other retail employers are also cutting back. Maybe you find something, but it's likely at lower pay without the same benefits, and there's no guarantee of the same hours. Or maybe you don't find anything quickly and you're suddenly navigating California's unemployment system, trying to make rent in a state where housing costs haven't come down just because jobs are disappearing. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is playing out right now in communities across California. The political implications here are significant, and they extend well beyond California's borders. Newsom has been positioning himself as a national Democratic figure, a potential future presidential candidate, someone who represents a progressive vision of governance. California has been the laboratory for policies that activists and progressives nationwide hope to see implemented more broadly. High minimum wages, strict environmental standards, strong tenant protections, universal healthcare aspirations. The implicit promise has been that these policies can coexist with a thriving economy, that you don't have to choose between worker protections and job creation, between environmental stewardship and business growth. But when major employers start exiting the state at scale, that narrative becomes harder to sustain. Critics have been arguing for years that California's regulatory environment was driving businesses away, and they've been largely dismissed by the state's political leadership as exaggerating or simply wrong. The Starbucks closures provide concrete evidence that something isn't working. It becomes very difficult to argue that the business climate is fine when businesses are literally closing hundreds of locations. This creates a political vulnerability that Newsom and California Democrats more broadly have to address. The Republican Party, which has been largely irrelevant in California state politics for the past decade, suddenly has an opening to argue that their warnings about overregulation were correct. More importantly, it gives moderate Democrats and independents, voters who support progressive goals in theory but care deeply about economic stability and job security, reason to question whether the current approach is sustainable. The national implications are equally important. Other states have been watching California's policy experiments closely. Some, particularly Democratic-controlled states in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, have been moving in similar directions on minimum wage and regulation. If California's model is seen as failing, it could slow or reverse that momentum. Conversely, Republican-led states will use California's struggles as evidence that their lower tax, lower regulation approach is superior, even if the reality is far more complicated than that simple narrative suggests. What's particularly frustrating about this situation is that there's very little middle ground in the public discourse. You're either on the side that thinks California's regulations are destroying the economy, or you're on the side that thinks any criticism of those regulations is just corporate propaganda and right-wing fear-mongering. The truth, as usual, is more nuanced. It's entirely possible to believe that workers deserve higher wages and better protections, and also believe that the specific implementation of those policies in California has created problems that need to be addressed. It's possible to support environmental regulation and also acknowledge that the cumulative burden of compliance has become prohibitive for some businesses. The challenge is that fixing this requires political courage that's in short supply. It means admitting that well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences. It means potentially scaling back some regulations or creating exemptions that will be criticized as sellouts to corporate interests. It means having honest conversations about trade-offs rather than pretending that every policy goal can be achieved simultaneously without cost. These are difficult conversations, and politicians generally avoid them until they're forced to have them by circumstances. The Starbucks closures might be that forcing moment for California. When the economic pain becomes visible and widespread enough, when enough workers who were supposed to benefit from progressive policies find themselves unemployed instead, the political pressure to reassess becomes impossible to ignore. The question is whether that reassessment happens proactively with thoughtful policy adjustments or reactively in the midst of a deeper economic crisis. It's also worth considering what this means for the future of work in California. If the traditional retail and service model becomes unsustainable, what replaces it? There's been a lot of talk about the gig economy, about automation, about the transition to higher skilled service jobs, but those transitions don't happen overnight, and they don't happen without significant disruption and pain for workers caught in the middle. A shift supervisor at Starbucks doesn't automatically become a software engineer or a healthcare professional just because their store closed. Retraining takes time and resources, and in the meantime, people still need to pay rent and feed their families. The commercial real estate angle deserves attention too. California's retail vacancy rates were already elevated before these closures were announced. The shift to online shopping, accelerated by the pandemic, permanently reduced demand for physical retail space. Now you're adding 300 more vacant storefronts to that equation, many of them in prime locations that were anchoring foot traffic in shopping districts and strip malls. Landlords who were counting on Starbucks as a reliable tenant now have to find replacements in a difficult market. Property values could decline, which affects tax revenues, which affects municipal budgets, which affects public services. It's all connected. There's also a quality of life dimension that doesn't show up in economic statistics, but matters to people. Starbucks locations serve as community gathering places, as safe public spaces where people can work or meet without spending much money, as reliable bathrooms in urban areas, as familiar landmarks that give neighborhoods character and continuity. When they disappear, especially in lower-income areas where alternatives might be limited, it degrades the social fabric in subtle but real ways. Looking ahead, the key question is whether this is the beginning of a larger exodus or an isolated adjustment by one company. Are we about to see similar announcements from other retail chains, restaurant groups, service businesses? Or will Starbucks closures create opportunities for smaller, more nimble competitors to fill the vacuum? The answer probably depends on whether California's political leadership treats this as a wake-up call or as an anomaly that doesn't require systemic response. The optimistic scenario is that this creates urgency for meaningful policy reform, streamlining regulations, addressing commercial rent issues, creating more flexibility in how labor laws are implemented, finding ways to support small businesses while still protecting workers. The pessimistic scenario is that the political environment is too polarized to allow for the kind of nuanced policymaking required, and California continues on its current trajectory until the economic damage becomes severe enough to force change through crisis rather than through thoughtful adjustment. What's clear is that something has to give. The status quo isn't sustainable. You can't have the highest costs of doing business in the country while also maintaining a thriving service economy that employs millions of middle-class workers. The math doesn't work. Either costs have to come down, or productivity has to go up dramatically, or businesses will continue making the calculation that Starbucks just made and deciding that California isn't where they want to be. For the people of California, this moment demands attention and engagement. This isn't about left versus right or progressive versus conservative. This is about whether the state's economic model can provide opportunity and stability for working families. That should be everyone's concern, regardless of political affiliation. The closures happening right now are a symptom of deeper structural issues. And addressing those issues requires moving past talking points and grappling with difficult realities. The question is whether California's leaders are ready to have that conversation, or whether it will take even more economic pain before the urgency becomes undeniable.